We're about to hear from Phillip Prager. And Phillip Prager is an assistant professor in aesthetics, aesthetics IT at the university. What does this mean here? Assistant professor in aesthetics.
At the IT.
Oh, at the IT University of Copenhagen. Sorry, a little syntactical misdirecting here. He also wanted me to let you know that he has a consulting company that deals with creativity, and that it's not psychobabble driven. And anyway, he's going to speak to us about the Modernist Muse.
Thank you. And let me just say it's a real pleasure and honor to be back here because Minerva has become my little sort of surrogate intellectual home since I was here 4 years ago as a postdoc. And I've already met a couple of people who've recognized me from 2 years ago when I was organizing the last conference on the importance of being playful. That time I spoke about Dada. This time round it's about the Bauhaus. So, the Bauhaus. Weimar Germany's iconic modernist school operated from 1919 to 1933, and it was famous for pioneering the integration of industry, science, and design. And the way the Bauhaus combined multiple disciplines remains widely admired even today. But curiously, in aesthetic terms, it is very commonly viewed as entrenched within the narrow confines of rationalism. It's often referred to as the quintessential example of rule-bound, hierarchical, and elitist modernism, hard, regular, geometric white shapes in steel, glass, and reinforced concrete. Now, I think that this traditional interpretation is not entirely fair, because to me it appears to be the result of quite outdated classical, romantic, and psychoanalytic notions of creativity, which are still quite dominant in art history, even in the 21st century. But if one were to assess the Bauhaus through scientific research, the Bauhaus actually documents a highly sophisticated understanding of cognition, its relationship to vision and perception. In fact, the Bauhaus where was I? Distilled principles of creative cognition half a century ahead of science, and basically ushered in what we now think of the modern understanding of artistic creativity. That, as I'll be showing, is validated by 21st century psychology. Research, which I might add, as an art historian, with which art history does not particularly enjoy engaging with at all. So I'm going to focus my discussion on László Moholy-Nagy, one of the most prominent Bauhaus artists and pedagogues, who played a key role in formulating the Bauhaus philosophy. Moholy had a particular enthusiasm for science, technology, formalist photography, and led the Vorkurs, the preliminary course, which was essentially the cornerstone of Bauhaus pedagogy. And he's often characterized as a utopian rationalist. Yet from the perspective of psychology, Moholy's theory and practice are not pleas for rationalism. Quite the contrary, he reveals a very visionary insight into the mechanisms of creative cognition, such as the importance of disinterestedness, conceptual recombination, categorical reduction, and play behavior. So what exactly is creativity and how can we define it? Well, from a cognitive point of view, creativity is typically defined as a combinational process in which seemingly incompatible concepts are blended into surprising new meanings. It's a sort of cut and paste process in which two concepts or complex mental structures are somehow combined to produce a new structure. not unlike the conceptual blending theory we were hearing about earlier on, which essentially describes this process in more detail. One of the reasons, now there are a variety of obstacles to creative thinking. Contrary to the notion of the romantic idea of freewheeling imagination, the range of computational possibilities our minds can make is constrained and structured by experience, memory, education, culture, language, and habit. This is what is referred to as our conceptual space. And it determines what thoughts are possible and what just simply remains impossible to think. Basically, our cognition is geared towards solving everyday tasks with expediency and efficiency. And it is crucial that our cognition is so economical because we have to make countless decisions in split seconds every day. Eleanor Roche refers to this as cognitive economy. As an example, imagine a collie. We could categorize a collie as a mammal, as an animal, or an organism, but we'll tend to think of it as a dog because that's the level of categorization, which is known as the basic level, which is most suitable for everyday life. We also correlate certain attributes according to what is known as our perceived world structure. As Eleanor Roche points out, we perceive the material objects of the world to possess high correlational structure. For example, we observe wings to co-occur more frequently with feathers than with fur, and we structure our cognitive category of the concept of wing accordingly. One very common assumption about creativity is that it is based on associative thinking, as in the stream of consciousness techniques of James Joyce or Marcel Proust. But while creative thinking certainly associates unusual concepts into surprising combinations, associations per se are not necessarily procreative if they are typical or conventional. And these are the sorts of associations we typically conjure up these are the sorts of associations we conjure up subconsciously and automatically. So basically what I'm trying to say is that principles such as the basic level, perceived world structure, these are all mental shortcuts, helpful when dealing with everyday situations that require immediate decision and action, but it comes at a cost. They also result in naive theories about how the world works, and they impose mental roadblocks to creative thought. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, because the Bauhaus artist Moholy-Nagy was very acutely aware of these counter-creative mental stumbling blocks and the way in which our minds employ these mental shortcuts and how they restrict flexible rearrangement of ideas and concepts into creative new constellations. He points out that the eye, together with our intellectual experience, supplements perceived optical phenomena by means of association and formally and spatially creates a conceptual image, which stultifies imagination. This prevents us from what he refers to as productive creativity, the ability to establish new relationships between the known and the as yet unknown optical, acoustical, and other functional phenomena. I think that these quotations are not only very insightful in how they acknowledge the counter-creative effects of conventional cognition and perception, but Moholy also presents a very demystified and prosaic definition of creativity as a combinational process that anticipates the definitions advanced by cognitive psychologists many years later, and which are in complete radical opposition to the prevailing romantic and psychoanalytic notions of creativity that were still popular back at that time. Now, Moholy approached the problem of the counter-creative conceptual image, as he called it, with real brilliant ingenuity. In the new medium of photography, he discovered a radical new tool that could be employed to unleash the creative imagination. And I'll show you how he did this. By viewing the world through the camera lens, Moholy proclaims, we may say that we see the world with entirely different eyes. So by placing a frame around the phenomenal world and exploiting the differences between human and camera perception, the camera lays bare the stereotypical and anthropocentric view with which we conventionally perceive our environment. He writes, in the photographic camera, we have the most reliable aid to a beginning of objective vision. Everyone will be compelled to see that which is optically true, is explicable in its own terms, is objective, before we can arrive at any possible subjective position. Now, obviously, whether the camera truly delivers an objective image is obviously philosophically questionable, but it's certainly less tainted by associations, memories, or ideologies, and it enables the viewer to look at the world from a novel perspective. It helps to restructure the relationships within an image by deactivating what he calls our, and I quote, intellectual experience. So now let's look at a couple of his famous formalist photographs. In Moholy's formalist photography, our established mental categories are defamiliarized, and we experience our surroundings not in terms of the conventional basic level, but at levels of categorization that we normally would not consciously entertain. So on the left, we don't necessarily see a domestic cat, but our attention is much more drawn to the luscious texture molded into a feline shape of a sculptural quality. On the right, we do not see a photo of the proud Empress of Australia gliding majestically through the ocean, I mean, but observe the rippled surface of a liquid that almost engulfs a delicately pointed and roughly hewn wedge, and its gently piercing of its surrounding matrix. The importance of overcoming the conceptual image, basic levels of categorization or perceived world structures, is emphasized by a very famous study by the cognitive psychologist Thomas Ward, in which he invited college students to basically just let their imagination run wild and draw the most fabulous, fantastic animals on a fantasy alien planet. And guess what happened? Although they were given the opportunity to indulge in the most fanciful flights of creative imagination, the fantasy aliens were remarkably unimaginative and surprisingly similar to animals on planet Earth. And they didn't even really vary much across the 50 participating students. Most animals included bilateral symmetry, appendages, eyes, and ears. If asked to imagine a feathered animal on a very different planet, it tended to have wings and beaks and no ears. Intelligent animals tended to have a humanoid form, wear clothing, and communicate. And young members of an alien species had larger heads in relation to the body than adult animals. And it's just incredibly interesting how subtle we've absorbed all these, theories about the world and how they they influence our imagination when especially in the West, where we still live, we're still quite close to the romantic notion of creativity with its promise of unleashed creativity. It just doesn't work like that. So these students were basically not just falling victim to well-established and entrenched categories of what an animal ought to look like or how it ought to behave, but were being influenced by a variety of very anthropocentric beliefs. For example, that vision is more important than hearing. Most of the animals had eyes, because that's the sense organ that we value most. Hence, that's what they put onto their imaginary animals. And after a lifetime of observing correlations between feathers and the ability to fly, wings were invariably associated with airborne travel. So since we perceive the world to correlate attributes such as feathers and flight, we easily develop naive theories about the world, such as that feathers must have evolved to fly, when in reality there are a huge variety of conflicting theories, such as that feathers evolved to insulate against heat loss or to enhance aerodynamics, and not necessarily to fly. So Moholy's enthusiasm for what he called objective vision may sound reductive, it may sound formalist, it may sound rationalist, but in the context of his arguments, it is actually the portal to creative cognition. Since the camera lens does not operate according to human principles of perception, photography has the unique ability to reproduce our surroundings from a less ego and anthropocentric perspective. The most fundamental difference between the mechanical and the human eye lies in the absence of the three-dimensional perspective. The camera bereaves humans of one of their most fundamental means of perceiving the world, stereoscopic vision. This is our ability to perceive three-dimensionally due to the distance between our eyes. For example, the photograph of Marseille on the left is shot through the wrought iron banister of a balcony. Stereoscopic vision would normally detract attention from the delicate pattern it confers upon the street. A casual glance would either dissolve the banister or obliterate the street. It is only in this photograph that one obtains a sense of here-ness on the balcony and simultaneous there-ness on the street. Bypassing principles of visual organization has a direct influence on cognition and category formation. Following Roche's theory of cognitive economy, we might normally categorize the banister as structural support or a security feature, while in the photograph it emerges as a carefully crafted ornament that highlights the role of the balcony as a transitional space, an intimate vantage point between apartment and city, while also enchanting the urban streetscape by overlaying an arabesque pattern. Now, human vision isn't only stereoscopic, it's also anisotropic, which means it is bottom-heavy in character. So two identical objects, for example, will look unbalanced if one is placed above the other. The higher object will have to be lighter, either in size or in color, because our vision prefers that which strives downward. Similarly, a cube is perceived as more stable and balanced than a diamond, even though the latter is merely a rotated cube. So manipulating the anisotropic character of our vision is also a hallmark of Moholy. He often frames his photographs diagonally and creates a disorienting effect that forces viewers to establish a completely new frame of reference. In this image on the right, the passers-by in the photo white diagonal, limited by their anthrocentric perspective and vision, would remain completely unaware of the geography they are traversing. But the bird's perspective, together with the anisotropic manipulation, creates the impression of an almost surgical collision of asphalt and nature, with the latter bleeding onto the walkway in irregular patches of dampness, an evocative and indeterminate composition of organic and geometric shapes and textures. So basically, the cognitive category of park is softened. It is both a network of walkways superimposed upon a green space as much as asphalt barriers constraining nature. Now, Moholy's photography may appear cool and harsh, but it's precisely such coolness that liberates the creative imagination by avoiding the pitfalls of the conceptual image which the participants in Ward's alien planet study fell victim to. Aspiring towards objectivity may contradict traditional notions of creativity as unrestrained, but it certainly tallies with neuroscientific research that has linked creative insight to low cortical arousal. Creative insights usually occur when we are not actively concentrating on a problem, but when our mental and visual attention is defocused. The benefit of having such a defocused mind is that it allows individuals to absorb much more varied, peripheral, and indiscriminate visual information. It allows the subconscious mind to experiment with unusual combinations of concepts without being filtered through intellectual experience. By contrast, individuals who are more analytic and creative problem solvers, they don't show this pattern at all. When they are engaged in problem-solving activity, their attention and cortical arousal is actually extremely high. So one could therefore argue that Moholy's use of photography as a pedagogical tool, as he himself describes it, is basically an externalization of this principle of creative cognition. The camera eye simulates the way in which high creative individuals perceive the world. The disinterested character of the camera lens, its alleged objectivity, is analogous to the defocused mental and visual attention of highly creative individuals. Just as high creative individuals perceive the world disinterestedly, the view through the mechanical eye guides one away from basic levels of categorization and stereotypical associations. Everyone is talented, Moholy proclaimed, and calls the camera the most reliable aid to a beginning of objective vision. We may say that we see the world with entirely different eyes. While such enthusiasm may sound utopian, I would argue that it is merely unromantic. His demystification and democratization of creative cognition is certainly not a eulogy to rationalism. He merely understands creativity understands that creative cognition, that some are better creative cognition than others, but that this is something that can actually be learned and taught, which compared to the romantic and classical notions where the cult of the genius reigns, is completely and utterly iconoclastic. So I've got 4 minutes. So Moholy's photographic pedagogy trains the disinterested state of mind conducive to creative insight. In the Bauhaus preliminary course, which was the prerequisite for all first years, and which he co-taught with Josef Albers from 1923 to 28, this creative sensibility is applied to actual creative problem solving. The point of departure at the Vorkurs was to experiment with the most abstract of materials and shapes. So very simple shapes, as you see over here. And one of the reasons Moholy believed this to be a productive point of view, a point of departure, is that basically simple geometric shapes just simply had carried no emotional, intellectual, associational value, and they were so simple that they could morph into just about anything and everything. And you see how experimenting just with these simple shapes, really original inventions came about. And what's quite interesting is that oftentimes he would actually ask them to rig up stuff just with random materials, and then only later on he would tell them what the assignment was actually going to be, whether they were supposed to invent a new kitchen appliance or a mode of locomotion or whatever. And in those instances where they first doodled and afterwards got an assignment, that's when the really creative ideas came about. When he first, if he told the students invent a new kitchen appliance by doodling with these three-dimensional objects, everybody just generated stereotypical, most immediate sort of things. And what's really interesting is that precisely the same methodology of using these really simple shapes was adopted in 1990 by the creativity scholar Ronald Fink, in complete, I think, ignorance of what the Bauhaus had done in the 1920s, also in an experiment about creativity. And similarly, he just gave his participants a variety of these three-dimensional objects and let them rig things up with them. And it was quite incredible how many, well, I don't know how many marketable inventions they came up with, but as you can see, they came up with, you know, things bordering on the marketable. And he too had three different groups. He had a group where he told them, you can pick the objects you want, and you can pick the category you want, say kitchen appliance. He had a group where everything was randomly assigned, the elements and the category, and it was the double chance, the double random group that really ended up producing the most original inventions, basically because you were confronted with these two completely incongruous inputs, and you had to make them relate, and you just had to come up with some crazy story, fanciful story to somehow make sense of them, and often completely ridiculous, and lots of laughter, but occasionally it worked really well. And as you can see, this the traditional, what we think of the traditional Bauhaus aesthetic as being all about clean lines, all about just hard angularity and all of this, that wasn't actually the aesthetic they were aiming for. It actually was based on an understanding of how creative intervention worked. And the early members of the Bauhaus, they were certainly not averse to ornament even. But there was a massive cultural shift in the Bauhaus in the mid-1920s where, I forget his name, basically the communists took over and everything got rather drab. And my last point that I want to just mention, this idea of rigging and improvising with three-dimensional objects without having a predefined outcome, just improvising and doodling. That's basically what play is, which is, I find really mind-boggling. I mean, we think of the Bauhaus as being this modernist, rationalist, scientific, utopian place where play certainly had no place, but it most certainly did, as in the Vorkurs I just showed, and I think probably the most outspoken advocate of the importance of play was Moholy-Nagy's contemporary Oskar Schlemmer, who was at the Bauhaus at the same time, and he very explicitly talks about the play instinct being the source of man's real creative values, the unself-conscious and naive pleasure in shaping and producing without asking questions about use or uselessness, sense or nonsense, good or bad, which I think is a lovely, evocative quotation. And it's really sad that Oskar Schlemmer's triadic ballet, which is what it's called, is in most books it's discussed as the epitome of 1920s dehumanization, alienation, and mechanization, which I find just so shocking, because the traditional notions of creativity are still with us even in the 21st century. And these are peculiarly Western traditions that are not shared by the rest of the world, certainly not by Eastern traditions. The classical tradition of the artist being in altered states of minds and being kissed by the muse, the romantic artist, the tortured soul, the psychoanalytic tradition where creative inspiration originates from sublimated desires and from the unconscious. And in all of these, you find a very, very heavy emphasis on correlating creativity with negative emotions, when all the research that's been done in the last years has always correlated creativity with positive emotions. And I think that's just really rather bizarre. That's it.
Thank you for that. Oh, is it? Okay. Thanks for the presentation. So when you gave Moholy-Nagy's definition of productive creativity, I was kind of confused as to the distinction between productive creativity and just creativity. It seems like a redundancy. Like I understand that it helps to understand, like, I quote, as yet unknown optical, acoustical, and other functional phenomena. But then you went on to say that it's without asking questions about use or uselessness, sense or nonsense, good or bad. So I'm kind of curious as to what makes productive creativity different than just creativity in design.
Yeah, I have no easy answer for that. But I would say that his elaboration on the acoustical and whatever else is just him really emphasizing how creative inspiration can really originate from even the most unsuspecting source, and as I was saying, how we are all confined by our conceptual space, which makes thoughts thinkable and unthinkable, and the only heuristic that can really break through that is chance, because that operates below the radar of our conceptual space. So for me, when I read that, it was just sort of a celebration of cultivating an open-mindedness to even the most unlikely source of possible creative inspiration. That's how I read it. But it was a strange wording. Yeah.